go. Okay, I think we are live. Alexander, Peter, I think we're live. Guys, if you can see me, let me know. Duran live number 44. What is this one called, Peter? World Unhinged.
Yeah, World Unhinged. Yeah, that was my idea.
How did you come up with that name, Peter?
All right, I'm trying to make sure. Good, we're on. I want to make sure. How did I come up with that? Every morning, I get up around 5 o'clock in the morning because of my dogs, and by 8 o'clock, I'm sitting in my cafe across the street. I'm the first one there, and that's where I spend the next 3 hours reading. Meaning, American Conservative, Antiwar.com, Zero Hedge, RT is pretty good, and then there's going to be places where Antiwar.com takes me. And I was just thinking, drinking my coffee, the world is completely unhinged, and the mainstream media doesn't have a clue of what's going on in the world. Not at all. You know, this whole Greenland story, which is, everyone is just mocking Trump. And on one level, I can understand that. But there's actually a history to the United States wanting to acquire Greenland. It's not completely out of the blue. And it has rare earths, which the United States desperately needs, where China, Russia, North Korea, those three countries have a nice lion's share. And so it's not such a comical story. The way Trump rolled it out on Twitter was his typical kind of buffoonish way of getting an issue out there. But it is a real issue. It's not going to go anywhere. But, the media focuses on all these stories for all the wrong reasons. I mean, the United Arab Emirates now is turning into the bridge between Iran and the Western world, when it was the Emirates that were the most anti-Iranian. Nobody's picked up on that at all. That is a game changer. Now you have the government in Iraq fighting over American planes in their airspace. That's not reported anywhere in the mainstream media. There's a trade war with South Korea and Japan. Again, the American alliance in the Pacific is flailing. I mean, so many things are going on. The world is getting unhinged. I'll tell you why. Because they're no longer afraid of the United States. That's why. Because the United States has played a very strong hand very badly for decades, and it's finally catching up. Finally. That's a preamble to.
That's the preamble.
Preamble of this talk. We're wrapping it up. That's right. My temperature is real high. I pass it over to Alexander McCarris to cool me down.
Alexander, how are you doing? You're looking good.
I'm very well. I'm very well.
Polo. Right on.
Indeed, right on. And I'm in Germany at the moment. I should explain to our viewers. I'm here partly on business, partly on pleasure, mainly pleasure, but also partly business. Very interesting to come to Germany to see what things are like here. I have many friends in Germany, and I'm in a part of Germany, the Rhineland-Pfalz, which is very, very much the heartland, the economic heartland of Germany. Frankfurt is nearby. Mainz is also nearby. The Ruhr is a bit to the far north. So we speak a lot to people in Germany, and I find that their views and their comments on the situation, both in Germany and in the world, are very interesting.
All right. Well, let's get rolling, guys. So Mercuris, the Oracle of London, is now the Oracle of Germany. And we have Peter Lavelle, host of RT's Crosstalk, who is in Moscow. Correct?
Still on vacation.
In Moscow. All right, great. So where is everyone checking in from? Let's see. We got from Thailand, James. We got Chuck in Canada. Let's see. We got Peter in Turkey. Gloria, Phoenix, Arizona. Once was my home, Phoenix. Alberta. Let's see. Chicago, Illinois. Ian from Norway. Multisphere from New York. From New Jersey. Where else are people checking in from? Let's see here. Southern Ontario. All right. Duran, can you say something about macaroni's meeting with Boris? Macaroni. Yeah, we'll get into Boris.
We'll certainly get into that. Don't worry.
We'll get into him meeting with.
Yeah, we don't need Saturday Night Live anymore because it's been irrelevant for at least 2 decades, maybe longer. We just have people like macaroni and boards. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah, that's for sure. Let's see. We have from Colombia, South America. Awesome. Edinburgh, Scotland, Sweden, UK, Scotland. Let's see. And there is the great Peter Lavelle. Yes, there he is. Let's see. From Ontario, from Holland, Rockaway, New York, Alberta, Canada, Amsterdam, New York City. Shout outs to the fans of the Duran. All right. Good day from Australia, from Bucharest, Romania, New York City, Liverpool, Ottawa, Zdravstvuyte. Greetings from Brazil, Australia, Thailand again, Northwest England, Bangkok, Thailand, Montreal, Central Florida, New York City. Let's get rolling, guys. Everyone, go to the Duran shop, pick up a t-shirt like that blue awesome polo that Alexander is wearing. That thing is damn awesome. Or you can pick up a magic mug like this one that I got right here. And what else? Donate to us on PayPal, Patreon. And we are now on Subscribestar. That helps keep the channel up and running. And remember to hit that like button, smash that like button. That helps the video get out there and reach as many people as possible. So we have the G7, guys. Coming up this weekend in Macaroni's country, home country of France. We're going to steal that macaroni name, by the way. So we're going to use that one. So let's see. Peter, G7, France, what are you expecting?
Ho hum. Okay. I don't really expect much. The only thing that really caught my eye about the G7 is that the suggestions that Russia may be invited again. I mean, one of the best foreign policy decisions Russia has experienced in the last few years is not being in the G8, okay? I mean, it's the G7 that screwed up the world. I'm sorry to be so blunt, okay? That Russia doesn't belong in that club, okay? It's far more effective in the G20, where it's with its peers, where it's with countries that are not attempting some kind of hegemony. So, I mean, the G7 is a spent force. I mean, look at the primary, one of the primary economies, well, two of them, Japan and Germany, are stagnant. And the United States is, for a variety of reasons, has a hot economy, but it's for very mixed reasons that I keep mentioning on these podcasts. I mean, as we speak right now, the Chinese retaliated before the last round of tariffs against it. It actually preempted Trump. Which is kind of an interesting diplomatic move. I mean, if you look, the G7 is nice and fine, but the heartland of America, its agricultural sector, is really hurting hard. And this is really one of the most important issues in this trade war with China. And it's the US's underbelly. It's its weakest link. And if you look at farm bankruptcies, the lack of credit for farmers, people that are leaving the business, it's really heartbreaking seeing this happen, because we call it the heartland for a reason, and agriculture is it. So, I mean, the G7 has a lot of internal problems to deal with, and I really wish they would focus on that, get their immigration policies in order, get their industrial policies / infrastructure in order. They should just leave the rest of the world alone, because it's evolving quite well without more interference from the G7.
Alexander, G7, what are you expecting?
Well, I'm not expecting anything, and Peter's absolutely right. I mean, it's an extraordinary time. And when Peter talks about the economics of this, there's two things to say. The G7 began in 1978 as a meeting of what were then the most important economies of the West at a place in France called Rambouillet. And it was specifically about finding solutions, joint solutions to the economic problems that were plaguing the West at that time. Now, we are in a period of extraordinary economic crisis, I use that word, and strangeness. Peter was talking about the world being unhinged. The single thing that for me shows how unhinged it has become is this extraordinary phenomenon of negative interest rates, of people actually being asked to borrow money and being told that they'll be paid money if they borrow, instead of having to pay interest. The lender will actually go on paying that. I mean, it's so inverted. It's so strange. And I said I was talking to people here in Germany. I've spoken to a person who was a fund manager at a German bank. I've chosen to a person who runs a restaurant here. I've spoken to various people. And the single thing that is exercising people here in Germany is this extraordinary crisis in interest rates, because it is causing such a major destabilization of the whole economic system. We're getting extraordinary malinvestment in all kinds of industries. We're no longer getting proper investment directed in an intelligent way. And it seems that so far from the G7 leaders addressing this problem, which, to be very clear, is unsustainable. I mean, negative interest rates cannot function for very long. A world economy cannot function where interest rates are negative. Instead of addressing this problem, actually, I'm not even sure what problems, if any, they're going to be addressing. They talk about Russia rejoining the G8. Some want it, others don't want it. The Russians haven't been asked. They made very clear they don't want to rejoin. They talk about, there's talk about Iran, there's talk about tariffs, but there is no central coherent idea about how to address the underlying problems of the world economy, of the geopolitical crises that are all raging all over the world. There's no real plan, no real vision. And I think we're going to see no real outcome.
Alexander McCarris is very interesting with these negative interest rates here. One would think, if you want to make a profit and add to the economy, which they should be in lockstep, but they very rarely are these days. With these negative interest rates, what are these major corporations going to do? They're going to be paid to borrow money so they can buy back their own shares and then pay themselves a dividend on it. This is what the financialization of the economy has come to. Yes. Okay, nothing real happens. Okay, it's financializing it. It's really playing with the books. This is an accountant's dream come true. And even with negative interest rates, you can't spur the economy because the real economy isn't being affected. It's actually a bone to shareholders where people are. It's the corporations themselves with their own shares are profiting from this, from money that is being public money that's being made available. It turns into just private wealth pursuit, which I have nothing against people pursuing wealth at all. I don't. Okay, but when it's completely divorced from the real economy, that's when I have a problem, because the economy exists for people. It doesn't exist for profits. Remember that. I do not worship the markets. I don't worship capitalism. Capitalism is an idea. I'm interested in policies. Okay. So, I mean, when all these right-wing fanatics talk about the market will fix everything, no, it won't. If you leave the market alone the way it is now, it will make things far worse. I'm sorry, everybody, but the Holy Grail is not the market for me. It's people.
Alexander, you're in Germany right now. What's the latest on Deutsche Bank?
Well,
are they going to bring it up during the G7? You think, is Merkel going to?
I don't think they're going to bring it up in the G7, because I don't think the people around that table have the expertise and the knowledge to discuss it in any detail. But of course, it is a major concern here in Germany. One of the things that you're hearing people say in Germany is that Germans are, of course, historically savers. They're historically investors. They invest very conservatively, traditionally in their own businesses. And their banking system has historically been structured around this. I mentioned a fund manager that I spoke to. He's a fund manager who works for a bank, a very solid bank, middle-ranking bank in Germany, which is restricted to one particular area of Germany, which is in fact the one I'm in, Rhineland-Pfalz. So you have, on top of this superstructure of stable, traditional German banks, you have this extraordinary wild banking system around Deutsche Bank that has been created, and it is draining money from the rest of the system, because as many people will tell you, since we have negative or zero interest rates, we are being forced to invest in ever riskier products. And that is doing exactly what Peter said. It is fueling speculation. It is an extremely dangerous thing, and it has many German people very concerned. And of course, Deutsche Bank, the problem of Deutsche Bank, the accumulated problems of Deutsche Bank hang over all of this. Nobody really knows what is going to happen with that. It is the great bomb, if you like, in the background.
Yeah. When is that bomb going to go off, guys?
Well, it's going off. And the thing is, and I have to absolutely agree with Alexander Makiris here, is that, not long ago, at least the public face, Deutsche Bank was like solid as rock, okay? And conservative, frugal, smart, and that's completely unraveled. And I guess that begs the question, was that just all a PR job to pull the wool over our eyes here? Because if Deutsche Bank is in trouble, Germany's in trouble. Absolutely. It's as simple as that. Yes. And a good part of Central Europe and other parts of the EU, they're in big trouble if Deutsche Bank is in trouble here. Seriously.
Yes. This is absolutely right. And as I say, when one travels around Germany, one sees still a very efficient, very modern, very well organized country. But as I said, these problems are accumulating, and there's no real sense again that anybody is really addressing these problems in any structured and coherent way. And if you know Germany, you will know that one of the characteristics of the German policymaking system is that it has historically been very methodical. They look at problems, they work out what they need to do, and they plan for them, and they do them. And that isn't happening this time. We have this complete sense of drift. And that is something that in post-war German history is completely unique. They've never been in a situation quite like this before.
And certainly not good, okay? No. Historically speaking, and I don't want to be misunderstood, but when Germany is stable and boring, it's a good thing.
Oh, yes.
Okay? It's a very good thing.
Yes.
Alexander,
where is Merkel in all this? Is she looking to pass the buck for Deutsche Bank to?
Good question. She's in the rear view. She's in the rear view mirror. Okay.
Very good question.
She's always positioned herself, guys, as this reliable, steady leader. At least that's been her image that she wanted to portray to the world and to Europe especially. But it looks like she's being very irresponsible here.
Well, my own. Obviously, I've only been here a short time, but my own impression is of her is that she's absent. I mean, she is no longer essentially in control in the sense of putting the levers and pressing the buttons and doing anything, but then no one else is. And this captures the sense of drift, that we have a system where, as Peter says, the Chancellor, the German Chancellor, the pivotal figure in decision-making here, is literally a receding figure in a country which is not yet in crisis, but in fact far from being yet in crisis, but where people can see this. As I said, people are struggling to make sense of what is going on. And that is very much the impression I get in Germany at the moment.
Yeah, because when Germany gets a cold, the rest of the European Union gets the flu.
Absolutely.
Don't misunderstand that, okay? For better or worse.
But she had a meeting with Boris Johnson recently. Nothing very much came of that. There was, again, kicking the can down the road. She says to him, come up with 30 days, in 30 days for a solution to the Irish backstop, and then we'll talk. This is incredibly complacent language, given what an important market for Germany Britain is. A German chancellor ought to be working hard to come up with solutions to this problem, or at least looking for answers to this problem. If they don't lie in Britain, looking for them elsewhere. But there is total sense, as I said, there's this Greek word stasis no motion. And this is what I think you see in the political system, even as people become increasingly concerned about the economic system. And may I add, of course, Rhineland-Pfalz, where I am, is one of the more historically prosperous parts of West Germany. It's, if I'm no doubt at all that if you fact traveled further east to the Eastern Länder, you would find a much darker mood there, where things have never been so strong.
I suggest everyone go to the American Conservative on their homepage. They have a brilliant article about the Eastern Länder in Germany, as Alexander Merkel is talking about, and the issue of immigration is actually really very well written. It's Peter Van Buren. I guess he's traveling around. I always like his stuff. It's extremely well written, and so you read so few things these days that are well written. He's a good writer. So
he's
go
a
to
good
American Conservative.
And a very fine diplomat by all accounts.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, I was on surfing the web for this G7 and seeing how the mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, all these guys were going to be covering the G7. And their big concern, Peter, was, kind of trying to gauge what gaffes Trump is going to do while he's there. I mean, remember the last G7 with that famous photo where Merkel and the globalists are standing over Trump, and Trump's just kind of sitting there, arms crossed. And their whole concern is trying to figure out ways to hit Trump. They're not really concerned, as you say, about policy or anything that's going on in the world. But you guys also mentioned recession when talking about Germany. But in the mainstream media, of course, they've also pivoted from Russia to racism and recession. So, Peter, you want to talk about all of this stuff that's going on with the G7, with trying to figure out a way that Trump's going to upset things, and with the way the media is shifting from Russia.
Yeah. Well, it's just another form of Trump derangement syndrome. It's so poisoned our body politic and our way of talking about politics. I mean, I was born and brought up and educated in the United States, and because of my job at RT and Crosstalk and this forum here, of course, I spend a lot of time covering the news. I'm one of the fortunate people in the world that's my profession. That's what I do, and I really enjoy it. But when I look at Western coverage, particularly American coverage of something like G7, they miss all of the important points. Yeah. I mean, what gaffe is Trump going to commit next? I mean, I was listening to what Alexander Merkel was saying about Germany. After the Munich crisis and the betrayal of Czechoslovakia, and then later the Nazis took over all of Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union had reached out to the British saying, we need some kind of condominium if we're going to have to contain Hitler. And the British were hemming and hawing, and they didn't know really what to do. So what they did was they put a few diplomats on a ship, and they sailed to then Leningrad. But what did the Nazis do? They communicated with Stalin, and communicating quite clearly that the Western powers have no interest in enforcing a collective security arrangement in Europe in the wake of the League of Nations. And so Ribbentrop just hopped on a plane and went to Moscow. Decisive, made decisions, while the British were just, going back and forth in the seas, when the Nazis invaded the Rhineland, retook possession of the Rhineland, what was going on in Britain? It was the crisis of the monarchy, and everyone's chasing the royal family and all that. Meanwhile, real things were happening in the world. Those two analogies I just gave you are so appropriate right now. There's a lot going on.
Yes.
And if the political elite, because it's an election cycle, is just waiting for a gaffe, then they have a lot more problems than they can even imagine. I'll tell you, living outside the United States, looking in, going from Russiagate to collusion, go now to racism and all that. It doesn't touch any of the issues that are in play at all.
No.
Okay. And the world sees that. The world actually does see it, that the United States is in disarray. And if the United States is in disarray, its entire Western-built Washington consensus will fray away, because the United States is not a reliable partner. No one understands really what the hell is going on. And it looks like a self-inflicted wound. So how in the world can something like the G7 be effective when no one knows what the most important party to that group is in complete disarray, because the political establishment in the United States and the media want to see their leader fail. They want to see him fail.
That is profoundly true. I mean,
incredible, isn't it, when you say that, Alexander? Isn't it? They want to see their leader fail. I mean,
yes, they do. They absolutely want to see their leader fail. They want to see Donald Trump humiliate himself at the G7 summit, so that it will pave the way for him to lose the election in 2020. I mean, this is an extraordinary situation, the like of which I have never seen before in my life. But the United States media, the political class, the diplomatic and security establishment, the deep state, if you like, they don't want Donald Trump to succeed. They still don't want Donald Trump to succeed.
The interesting thing is here, if you want to see really biting political satire, watch Greg Gutfeld. I think it's on. He's on Sunday, right, Alex?
Yeah.
He's got a Sunday show. He's got
but see what he does is I don't really particularly like his program, but I like his opening monologue, because I think he's really kind of tells us where the winds are blowing, because he's a really hardcore Trump supporter. But what he does is, and again, this is connected to wanting to see Trump fail. Every time Trump fails in the eyes of the establishment, it is celebrated by his base. It is so counterproductive, what they do. Okay, Trump was, I don't know where he was stumping, but it was a factory town and they build trucks. I like trucks. I played with trucks when I was 4. I always said I'd like trucks. So my mom said I like trucks. And of course, for the sophisticated people on each coast, they think that he's a buffoon. But a lot of people in the heartland say, yeah, I like trucks too. See, you have two completely images of this one thing that's going on. And I recognize that. I can understand how he doesn't seem very couth, but I can certainly understand somebody in Nebraska saying, we finally got a president that likes trucks. Don't you see how self-destructive this whole exercise is? And because Trump likes trucks, what does that have to do with anything to do with policy? Nothing. There's no policy ever talked about, except he's a racist now. I mean, here's a guy that was in deep and dirty in the real estate world of New York and New Jersey, all in the Hollywood, all in the entertainment thing. I mean, that's one of the most diverse crowds in American society. Okay, and he's a racist. I still don't see it. I see awkward tweets. I see things that I certainly wouldn't say, but I wouldn't say that comes from anything like racism. It kind of reminds me of my father. He had these kind of like stereotypes, but he really didn't have anything against people. He just kind of saw them in certain ways. I don't think that's racism. Okay, certainly not for the sophisticated elitist in the media. That's not the case. So this is such a bizarre time we live in, because everything they're talking about, moaning about, has nothing to do with the real world.
Alexander, what do you make of the U.S. going into recession? Do you think it's going to happen before the 2020 elections or after? And even though they're trying to shift away from Russiagate, I know you know better than anybody else, Russiagate is, at least it seems, it's not going away. We're actually starting to connect a lot of dots. So you want to comment on both Russiagate and the U.S. recession? Because I have a hard time understanding when and if the U.S. is going to go into recession.
I'm going to make a prediction, which is probably I may very well be wrong, but I think the US will avoid recession before the 2020 election.
That's my gut too. That's my gut.
Growth will slow. There are accumulating problems in the United States economy because, briefly, there's been far too much credit emission. And this is a long-standing problem that goes back long before Donald Trump. And an awful lot of the very impressive GDP figures we see are simply the product of excessive credit emission. But I think this ball is going to be kept on the road for at least another year, perhaps even slightly longer. As to when a recession will happen, no one can ever predict the moment a recession will begin. I've seen people try, and they always and invariably get it wrong. So I don't say personally in such and such a month or in such and such a year, there will be a recession. But that there are accumulated problems, undoubtedly there are. I don't think they will hit home before the presidential election.
If I could just add to that, Alexander, Christopher, the reason why you're asking the question, and I'm not faulting you here at all, is that, and I actually posted something on Facebook, is that the liberal media wants a recession, because they keep talking about, they want, this is like wish fulfillment.
Yes.
I mean, objectively speaking, Alexander Mercuris is absolutely right. I mean, I look at the indices, there's some really troubling spots. Like I said, agriculture is really troubling. Other sectors are doing pretty well. And what we're seeing right now with the tax cut and the readjustment to trade with China, we're in a big flux right now. It's really kind of hard to read the tea leaves right now, because we have the effect of the lingering effects of the tax cut, which was very beneficial for the rich, I have to admit, and then just readjusting of trade trading chains around the world, and people are trying to readjust to that. And does that mean it's going to be a recession? Obviously not. Is it possible? It's always possible. Okay, I mean, if something goes terribly wrong, and I hope we talk a little bit about what's going on vis-a-vis Iran. I mean, oil supply crisis obviously would send the global economy into recession. There's a lot of things that could happen here. And I think that's top of mind for Donald Trump. And I think that is probably the single most important way to try to understand what his foreign policy is that it is so convoluted, it is so contradictory, but there's really only one thread all the way through all these quote unquote crises, which are usually generated by the US and its allies, is that Trump doesn't want to get into a shooting conflict that's going to hurt his reelection bid. He constantly, and no president in my lifetime, I mean, I'm not giving kudos to Trump about this, but he is, in his mind and his electorate, his base, he is keeping his promises. Okay, he really does, and he's very aware of that. And I think he also, and the people around him, is that the only thing that they think, considering the clowns up against him and the other party, I mean, only a recession is going to trip him up and getting reelected. The rest of it, look, I look at the polls say that Biden's up to double digits above Trump. They love to talk about it. These polls are ridiculous. Number one, the polls were wrong in 2016, so take that on board. Number two, these are national polls. It's the Electoral College that elects the president, not the people, for better or worse. So I'm more interested where he stands in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Florida, and Texas. That's where I'm interested in. But no, all of these polls, they're nationwide, 2,000 people, margin of error of 1.2 to 3%. It's all blah, blah, blah. It's the polling agencies making a lot of money and giving cannon fodder to the left, okay? When we get closer and we look at specific states, that's when it counts.
Alexander,
I'm sorry to interrupt about Russia.
Yeah,
Go.
Where is the world today, Alexander, with regards to the global financial situation, the economy, the U.S., Europe, China, Russia? I mean, is there a certain theme that's playing out, or is everyone really going off on their own tangents, and it's really that difficult to kind of see where the momentum is heading?
Alex, you've asked a question which probably needs a book to answer, but I'm going to make a.
Yeah, but you're the one man. You're the one man that can do it in a couple of.
I'm going to make a stab. I am going to make a stab at it. I think two things have happened. I think that after the end of the Cold War, we saw this massive process of financialization and globalization that Peter was talking about, which could only happen in that kind of situation where there was a unipolar moment, when the dollar was the undisputed world currency, when the United States was the hyperpower that could enforce its positions on everybody, and where the United States no longer had a significant economic and geopolitical challenger. Now we are moving away from that world. And what we are seeing is a huge process of adjustment to this. So firstly, we still have this huge momentum which was created during the sort of period of the unipolar moment of financialization. But as I said, I think that's going to run its course. I think we're going to see a move back towards tariffs, and we're going to see a move back towards a bipolar world with the two big power blocks being the United States and the rest of the Anglosphere and the Eurasian powers. And we were going back to the G7 summit. I mean, that's the other thing they're not talking about. They're not talking about the economy and the state of the world economy and the problems of negative interest rates, all of those things. And neither are they talking about the single greatest overarching geopolitical question of the present, which is this extraordinary drift of the United States and China from a situation of partnership, which had existed for so long, with the United States the dominant partner and China the subservient one, to a situation where they are now starting to think of themselves increasingly as geopolitical and economic and trading adversaries. And there doesn't seem to be any real discussion of this. But as I said, once these major problems in the world have sorted themselves out, I predict that we will see in around 10 years' time, as I said, a stable bipolar system with, as I say, the Eurasian powers on the one hand, the United States and the rest of the Anglosphere on the other. And I suspect Europe, the Middle East will be areas of conflict, or rather not conflict, but of rivalry, shall we say.
Okay, but that's interesting, because that there's a built-in assumption there that the Thucydides trap is that the U.S. will take the course of reconciling itself to a equal power, and I would like to see that happen. The problem is exceptionalism, and that's how that's what they're going to have to do, is to square that circle. We've said previously on this forum is that, and I'm going to echo what Alexander Mercouris had to say, is that we're going to have a bipolar information world where you're going to have one OS in your world. In the China world, they'll have an OS, and in the Western world, they'll have an OS. One of the things that's going to be very interesting is to see how the West reconciles itself as the West, which is a big question mark right now. Yes. And this is going to, and for them to be able to be a cohesive, meaningful power, or a mega power with all its moving parts, there's got to be a lot of reconciliation there, because everyone, and I always have to say, I'm a conservative person, but I don't feel like I'm part of the mainstream, and millions of people all through Europe and the United States feel that way, and they feel like they're being crowded out. This is at the same time with the first time in the Western world in modern history is that another non-Western power has the capacity to take the torch. This has never happened. And I'm looking back, from the end of the Crusades to the start of the exploration of the Western world by the Europeans. There's never been a non-Western power that makes a bid for at least parity. And the West is in complete disarray to take on that challenge.
Yes.
This is what's really interesting right now, because Alexander Mercouris and I have both been to China. Unity. They have unity. We could discuss the ways and means that they have it, and it's a worthy discussion. But there's no such thing as unity in the West. Its mantra of diversity is tearing the West apart at the seams.
Alexander, before we get to the super chats, we have a lot of chats to get to, a lot of questions to answer. Post-INF arms race. Alexander, Peter, this is
big question mark. Big question mark.
We've got some missile testing that's going on via the U.S., correct, Alexander?
Absolutely. They've tested a medium-range land-based cruise missile, the Tomahawk cruise missile, of the kind, by the way, that they were installing in Western Europe in the 1980s, and which caused all that trouble then. And of course, this has happened literally days after the United
Oh, wow. What a coincidence. What a coincidence.
So, I mean, we've been hearing all these stories about how the Russians were violating the INF treaty, how these launch systems in Eastern Europe that have been installed, which are capable of operating these cruise missiles, aren't really in danger because the United States has no such cruise missiles. And of course, within days of the treaty being scrapped, there we are, we see the cruise missiles there. And it turns out that the Russians were right about all of this all along. I don't think anybody, by the way, anybody in their senses had any doubt about that. I mean, they told so many absurd stories about those supposed anti-ballistic missile interceptors, that they were supposed to provide protection against Iran.
In Eastern Europe.
In Eastern Europe. Well, I mean, no one hears any more about that anymore. That Russia was not the target. Well, it's quite clear that Russia is the target, and it's quite clear. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the agenda is to bring back these missiles into Eastern Europe, and it's always been there. The problem is, this is 1980s thinking in a world that has now changed. I mean, the Russians are able to have developed comparable systems that can now reach the United States from their own territory. And of course, the Russians and the Chinese, we must never forget the Russians, are now, as I said, de facto allies, if you wish, at least partners, strategic partners. They have each other at their back. The Chinese are in the process of a massive naval build-up in the Pacific. Yeah. The Russians have a build-up of their own. They've developed hypersonic missiles. The United States is dangerously close to an arms race with two powers whose aggregate resources are greater than its own. And that is a very, 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 very bad position.
And the interesting thing is, too, is that there's a good example of this is the Straits of Hormuz, where the Russians and the Chinese together might patrol navigation there. Again, the law of unintended consequences. Yes. And Alexander McGarris is absolutely right. Russia's primary geopolitical mission is to make sure that the Russian Federation's borders are secure. Exactly. And it has the capacity to have overwhelming strength to retaliate if attacked. That's a pretty simple mission, okay? You don't need to spend, this 80s thinking that we'll spend the Russians to make them collapse, okay? That's not going to happen because the Russians and the Chinese won't participate in it, okay? Because they will have defensive, very, very superior defensive capacity. So the U.S. can spend its way into oblivion. The Russians and the Chinese only have to spend as much as they need further to support their own national security interest. Russia's national security interest is itself. China's national security interest is itself. The United States has taken, and its allies have taken on the entire world as its interest. That is a fundamental error. Who's going to spend themselves into the ground? It's not going to be the Chinese and the Russians. No. Mark my words.
No.
Alexander, you said that Russia is a target. A target for what?
Well, I think this is one. Let's actually talk about Russia, because I think this is the other thing that ought to be discussed in the G7, but isn't. Because, of course, we have a situation where more and more people in the West, we saw this in an editorial in the New York Times. We've seen this with President Macron meeting Putin.
Macron.
Exactly. We've seen all kinds of people saying, we must find ways of rebuilding our bridges to Russia, because Russia is the country that is now drifting closer to China and is making this challenge to us so much greater. So we must somehow detach Russia from China.
No.
At the same time, as they're talking in this way, they are busy planting and missile interceptors in Eastern Europe and testing Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are clearly targeting Russian strategic positions in Russian territory. So it is a totally schizophrenic policy. They have no real logic behind what they're doing. And yes, they are targeting the Russians. That is what this this cruise missile test was all about. The United States has talked about developing intermediate nuclear forces to counter China in the Pacific. And no doubt it will do that. But this particular type of system that we've seen tested today is intended for installation in Eastern Europe to strike at Russia.
And South
South
Korea,
Russia.
most likely. In South Korea is most likely.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, Alexander, Christopher,
No.
I didn't hear your question.
And South Korea. So what Alexander's saying, missiles in Romania or Poland, I would imagine it's Romania or Poland, where it's
In Poland, that's right, yes.
installed in order to hit Russia.
Yes.
That's the purpose of this.
That's it. That's the price. So you have, at one and the same time, the policy of confrontation with Russia being pursued, even though that policy is failing, by the way, and is increasingly understood to be driving Russia towards a closer and closer relationship with China. And at the same time, you have all these muddled and half-hearted and ham-fisted talk about, Russia being this great European country that we must bring back into the European and Western.
No, it's like
invite them into the G8, and we're going to do all these things, but without any real attempt to address Russia's actual and very real concerns. So
no, it's like when Putin met with Macron.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially the message is we need to start building bridges. But watch Macron's opening statements, lecturing his guest about democracy. Oh, what is it? Week 41 of the Yellow Vests yet? Okay, and you're talking about and then you have the United States and its allies fermenting a colored revolution in Hong Kong. It's completely anti-democratic. Okay, I mean, I'll tell you from the Kremlin's point of view is that the Kremlin learned a long time ago, your words are worthless. We watch your actions. We don't care about your words because your words are worthless.
Yes.
All right? And I watched Macron, this little boy. I mean, my God, that's the best they could pick. Nobody in the policy establishment in the country I live in now, Russia, takes it seriously.
No.
It's your actions that we care about.
Exactly.
And what a country like France, lecturing other people about, protest in Russia when nothing is ever mentioned by the yellow vest. Oh, by the way, in the last round of demonstrations in Moscow, nobody lost their eye or broke a bone. Okay, Mr. French President, how many people have lost an eye protesting in your country, your government? Be an interesting answer.
I think one person came away with a bruise.
Yeah. Al in the chat says no one has any intentions to hit Russia. What for? Question mark. What for?
Well, no. But it's the logic here. See, this is what people don't understand. Yes, Russia is a threat to the West. Yes, of course it is, because it exists. The very existence of Russia as a non-compliant power with the Washington consensus, by definition, makes it a threat. And that's why Russia understands how they see Russia as a threat, and they must react to it. Russia has the military capacity to obliterate the Western world, and it will maintain that as a deterrent. The problem is, going back to the 1980s, they understood deterrence. That's why they had the Intermediate Missile Treaty, because it enhanced deterrence, the mass assured destruction. If you read the foreign policy, foreign policy's basically standard bearer. I mean, I think it was even 10 years ago, they started thinking about a first strike capability against Russia. because of the unipolar moment. The problem is the unipolar moment is over. John Bolton doesn't understand that yet because he won't allow it, because we live in this ideologicalized time in the West. I started out our conversation, there is so much going on in the world, and they willfully blind themselves to not taking interest in things that could very much destabilize the United States. And then because of that destabilization, you become threatening, and then you will lash out. Trump is thinking about a blockade of Venezuela. That is astounding. Why? Because his policy has failed there. The policy against Iran has failed. The policy in Iraq has failed. The policy in Syria has failed. All of these failures just makes the United States and its allies more aggressive, because it is actually losing left and right, and they can't process it because they're morally superior to everybody else, and their system is morally superior, and their economics are morally superior. And we started talking about the irrelevance of G7 because all of what they think is their superiority is in tatters right now. And the outside world looking in knows this.
Yes, can I just add something to that? Because of course there was the question about nobody is considering a strike on Russia. Well, if that is so, why scrap the INF treaty? Why scrap the anti-ballistic missile treaty? Why test cruise missiles, Tomahawk, medium-range Tomahawk cruise?
What about START 2?
In that effect, exactly. Why refuse to negotiate with START 2? Why refuse to negotiate on cyber weapons? Russians have repeatedly offered talks on limitations on cyber warfare. Why refuse to do any of these things? And the point eventually comes when the Russians say to themselves, well, it's quite clear that you think of yourselves as our enemy, and we're going to start responding to that fact. And that's what we are seeing. But it is very important to stress, it is the West that has been driving this process. It is the West, it is the United States that unilaterally abrogated the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It is the United States that took the initiative to scrap the INF treaty. It is the United States which is refusing to negotiate meaningful extensions to the START 2 treaty. And it is the United States which is refusing to negotiate on cyber warfare. If the United States changes that position and starts negotiating in earnest with these things, then I will begin to, and renounces any idea of installing weapon systems in Eastern Europe, and removes those bases in Eastern Europe, which it has installed. Also, by the way, contrary to agreements it made with the Russians at the time of the end of the Cold War, then I will start to say, clearly, there is no prospect or danger or risk of anybody starting anything with the Russians, which might get out of control. But when I see what is happening, I cannot share that view.
From Isabel in the chat, does the panel think the way the world is moving, what is becoming clear is how isolated from the world of the northern landmass America is? Do you think this fear drives American foreign policy? So is this fear driving America's policy? And Alexander, before you answer that, I also want to try and play devil's advocate, maybe be a little balanced and fair. What would you criticize China and Russia for in driving this this exit from the INF treaty and this arms race? You know, if you had to look at things from a more balanced perspective.
Right. Okay. Well, let's deal first with the United States. I think the geographical isolation of the United States has bred complacency. I think if the United States was closer physically to the points of danger around the world, and it had perhaps a rather more fraught history where it had experienced repeated invasions of its own territory, as every state in Europe and Asia has done, I think that the United States might not come to this to the world today with this belief in its own exceptionalism and its own immunity from possible responses that might come. Now, I get to take it where China and Russia are concerned. I get to take a counterintuitive view to this. I think the Chinese and the Russians have played a part in allowing things to drift as they have done by being very, very slow to respond to the things that the United States was doing. I think that both the Chinese and the Russians, especially, dare I say, the Chinese, believed that they could come to some kind of reasonable understanding with the United States for far too long. And I think that the United States thought that if it went ahead and pushed and went on pushing, the Chinese would eventually become more accommodating, because they saw how accommodating the Chinese and the Russians had been in the past. But, you know, it's difficult. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. And people in Moscow and Beijing, being, in my opinion, highly realistic about foreign policy, make the mistake, they repeatedly make the mistake of assuming that everybody in Washington and London is as realistic as they are. And the reality is that they're not.
Peter, close out the first hour.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't really have any major criticism. I guess really the kind of echo in a different way from what Alexander Mercouris had to say is that I think maybe the Chinese and Russians could be at fault for being reacting to Washington more than being proactive. I think, you know, there you could make that argument. But the problem here is that it's ideology. See, the Chinese have an ideology at home. Okay, I have no doubt about that. But they have no kind of ideological view of the world. They're not in their foreign policy isn't informed by ideology. Russian foreign policy certainly isn't informed by ideology. But the problem is that Washington is fully informed by an ideology and a worldview of exceptionalism, and that's what screws up all the works, okay? And that's what makes for the Chinese and the Russians, it's very difficult for them to deal with the Americans and their allies, because they're trapped in an ideology where they truly believe that everyone in Russia and everyone in China wants to be like someone in France or Germany or Canada or the United States, which is patently untrue. Mm-hmm. And see, one of the things that, you know, we could go on and on and on about economics and all that, but, you know, the left doesn't want to talk about culture, and they don't want to talk about how people see their culture and how it informs their behaviors. I mean, the Russians, in the 20 years or so that I've lived here, they have re-embraced their identity, not diluted it, embraced it, and going back to basics, as they say, okay? And the Chinese are damn proud to be Chinese. I see them every day in Moscow, particularly during my time of vacation. They're everywhere, okay? And they're very proud, and they have money in their pocket, okay? And so I think it's the problem is that if we look at if there's the Russia-China strategic partnership, if that's one side, and you have Washington and its allies on the other, it's ideology that gets in the way, and it's ideology that makes it very difficult to negotiate, because one takes a moral superiority stand, which is not good in diplomacy. It has no place in diplomacy, and that's the real problem here.
Yeah.
All right, we've closed out our first hour. Remember to hit that like button, everybody. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please subscribe and share the channel with everybody you know, so we can reach the most people we can possibly reach. So guys, let's do some super chats here. We got a lot to get through. From Nanook44, super chat, Utah. He's checking in from Utah. Thank you for that super chat, Nanook. From Penguins fan, Alexander, is Russia ready for EU to lift sanctions? Is Russia ready?
I think that the Russians are past caring whether the EU lifts sanctions or not, frankly. I mean, parts of the Russian economy, agriculture especially, have done very, very, very well from the sanctions and from the counter-sanctions. And if the EU lifts those sanctions, that it has, and the Russians find themselves obliged to lift the counter sanctions that they imposed, restricting EU food imports. I think by now, the Russian agricultural complex has achieved such a critical mass over these 5 years that those sanctions have been in place, that frankly, the Europeans are not going to recover the market share in Russia that they have irretrievably lost. If you're talking about the rest of the Russian economy, where the Russians have been steadily and methodically developing their own replacements for industrial goods that they have that they used to import from the West, I think that process is actually accelerating. And I think that's going to accelerate even more, irrespective of whether sanctions are imposed or are maintained or lifted. Russia has major problems now, developing gas turbines, developing aircraft engines, developing AI technologies. If it is working in partnership with any country in these projects, it is with China. It is certainly not going to give up on these projects because sanctions are lifted. And in the all-important world of finance, the days when Russian companies would go to Western banks and borrow money to develop their factories in the West, those two are well and truly gone. The Russian financial system is gradually is now actually pretty close to the point where it can support Russian economic growth itself. And again, the Kremlin is not going to allow that to happen anymore. I mean, it will simply tell, as it can, Russian companies and Russian banks, we don't want you to borrow on Western markets in the same way that you used to do anymore. You're going to work within our own financial system, borrowing from Sberbank and VTB, and raising money on the Russian stock market, as they're increasingly doing.
Yep.
Okay, Peter, super chat from Colin. Yemen war is equal to Saudi and UAE Gulf port to bypass Hormuz. You have some updates on the Yemen war as well. I think that you could relay us.
Well, the interesting thing here.
You mentioned you mentioned Hormuz before we started.
Well, the thing is that the entire Trump, Jared Kushner, Netanyahu MBS gambit of only a few months ago is completely in tatters. It's fallen apart. The UAE, which was the biggest supporter of going after the Houthi in Yemen, they've really had a change of heart, a change of policy. They're actually making overtures to Iran. So certainly is Iraq. And I don't remember what official it was in Tehran, but it wouldn't take a few missiles to destroy your beautiful glass skyscrapers. I mean, you'd be out of business, put you back 10 years. And so the myth of American invincibility and the security umbrella that the Gulf countries believed in is coming apart at the seams. And I think there's a lot of shifting of forces going on in the Middle East, and it's because of this failed policy against Iran. We had, I think it was 2 or 3 months ago, so correct me if I'm wrong, but when there was a security conference in, I think it was Tel Aviv, and the Russians were there, and they made it very clear that Iran is a strategic partner of Russia. They'd never said that before. No. Okay. I mean, I've had Iranian friends that say, why can't the Russians go just a step further? And I've always said they look after their national interests first, like you look after your national interests first. And so, and also the Chinese have made it very clear that regime change in Tehran is not going to happen. And it's, again, we've talked so many times, the Russians and the Chinese have offered a security plan for stability in the Gulf countries, on the Straits of Hormuz. It's been presented to the United Nations. I bet no one in the mainstream media has ever mentioned that. But it's the players on the ground that are beginning to look at this here. And of course, the relationship that Saudi Arabia has with China. China, again, is just there for economic reasons. But people in the region are turning to China, asking about their strategic thinking about the region. Now, this is a huge game changer, because this was an outpost of the US. And now there's a lot of people, powerful people, that are looking for different ways to communicate and negotiate and to talk to each other. And it, again, you'll get this, we'll get these moments of tension, with Iran, will there be a war and all that? That's more of a propaganda war on the part of the Israelis and the US. There's a lot of people thinking, hey, we live in this region, we can do this. And plus, you have to remember, the United Arab Emirates, they have a huge underground gas field that that is basically under both the Emirates and Iran. I mean, and they are talking about exploiting it. Okay, and this is the realism that's coming back in because of the bombastic rhetoric coming from buffoons like Bolton and Pompeo. Is that people are just saying, you really can't be serious. And then I'll finish off with this, with the unmitigated disaster of MBS in his foreign policy. Everything that guy touches turns to, what, okay? I mean, and so what's going on is that the more tension, the more flaring up of this rhetoric only empowers Iran. It's amazing how Iran comes out on top all of the time, even with all of these sanctions here. Okay, so it's really quite remarkable. It is the quintessential example of the law of unintended consequences. Okay, and the people like Pompeo and Bolton are so ideologically blinded they can't see it.
Yeah, can I just add something? I mean, the idea of creating a route through Yemen, presumably through the port of Aden, to bypass the Strait of Hormuz, might have been a part of the agenda when the war against Yemen was launched in 2015. But that presupposed that war would end in victory. What is actually happening is that it seems now that it's probably going to end in defeat, because what has happened, as Peter rightly says, is that the United Arab Emirates has given up on the war and has pulled out. The people who are now in control of Aden are not friends of Saudi Arabia or indeed of the United States. They are the former communist government that used to rule South Yemen during the Cold War, and they've thrown out of Aden the government that the Saudis supported in Yemen, and have re-established themselves there, and apparently want to make South Yemen again an independent government. And apparently they are now outreaching their old allies, their old friends, people like Cuba, and of course Russia, because that was the countries that they were previously associated with. And in North Yemen, it seems that the Houthis, as I said, are on a roll, with the forces of the United Arab Emirates slowly pulling out. So if that was the plan, if the plan was to conquer Yemen and to build it up as another way, and another route to bypass the Straits of Hormuz, and that would have required, by the way, huge investments in infrastructure over many years. But let's say that had been the agenda. That agenda, as I am speaking now, looks as if it has ended in total failure. Now, how much better the policy to keep the Straits of Hormuz open by maintaining good relations with Iran? You don't need a war with Yemen in that case. You don't, which you're losing. You don't need to invest massively in infrastructure. You could just have good relations with Iran, which has made it repeatedly clear that it wants good relations with the West. So why embark on these dangerous, expensive, and foolish wars, which end, it seems, always in defeat rather than victory, when you can have peace and all you want through peace, but that would mean accommodating the interests of other powers, in this case, Iran?
There are reports, and I say only reports, and I haven't seen multiple confirmations that the Israelis might throw their hat in now and start bombing installations in Yemen, which of course is a signal to their friend Saudi Arabia that they might be able to pick up the slack, which of course region-wide would be a horrific decision to make. I mean, I'm serious. I mean, now the Israelis want to start bombing another country, the poorest country in the region, one of the poorest countries in the world. And the Israelis want to make it in there like they in Syria just to churn the quagmire, okay? There are reports of this. I don't know their validity, but certainly people are talking about that. So there are people that still want to keep it going.
Yeah.
Alexander, super chat from Penguins fan. Where is the Russian economy ranked right now? Is it up or down?
Well, obviously, if you read the Financial Times, they predict disaster and crisis almost every week and every month. I mean, if you go all the way back to the 1990s, in fact, ever since Putin came in, it's always been failing, even whilst it's succeeding. The only time they were happy with the way things were going economically in Russia was in the 1990s, when it was failing instead of increasing. I personally consider the Russian economy to be in reasonably good shape. Now, the Russian government and the Russian central bank, as I have repeatedly been saying for many years now, has been prioritizing the fight against inflation. They regard the very, very high inflation that Russia has suffered from. And by the way, inflation has been high in Russia since probably the late 1960s. It is a much more prolonged problem than people realized. The reason it was masked was because the Soviet Union controlled prices so that inflation expressed itself through shortages in shops rather than visibly in higher prices. But there has probably been inflation in Russia for a very long time. Now, I have expressed the view on many occasions, on programs I've done for the Duran, in articles I've written for the Duran, in lots of other places, that I think the central bank has overplayed this policy. And I think it's kept interest rates too high.
Way too high
for way too long. And I think it made a very serious policy error last autumn when, in the face of a short-term inflation blip caused by the rise in oil prices that year, that's last year, it increased interest rates again when it ought to have been reducing them. Now, in a situation where interest rates are very high, Russia currently, by the way, has zero inflation. And over the last couple of weeks, it's actually been in deflation, whereas nominal interest rates are around 7.5%, which is absurd. Where you have such high interest rates and where the Russian government itself is running a budget surplus, that can only affect aggregate demand. And that is why you are hearing people in Russia grumbling about disposable incomes not rising, but instead falling. It is the direct product of the central bank's excessively tight monetary policy. Now, what has been very interesting is that despite the fact that aggregate demand has been screwed down, and as I said, disposable income slightly grew last year. It's fallen back a little this year. Despite the fact that, as I said, disposable income has been under pressure, the actual productive parts of the economy, industry, manufacturing, agriculture, have all been steadily growing. So we've had around 3% growth in the industrial and manufacturing economy. We've had something like the same growth in agriculture. So what has happened is that the country's productive forces, its industries, its agriculture, its scientific, technological base are getting stronger. Inflation is falling. It's now predicted to fall well below 4% this year, which is the central bank's target, because, as I said, they imposed too tight a monetary policy on Russia this year. So inflation is falling. Interest rates are now once again starting to edge down. And the government has said that it will start a major program of infrastructure spending and investing in education and healthcare, all of which from the second half of this year should start to make overall economic growth higher than it has been in the first half of this year. So economic growth in the first half of this year has been around 1%. The official figure is 0.7, but I believe it's been around 1% for various reasons, which I'm not going to go into. I think it will be significantly higher in the second half of this year. And can I just say that no Western economy would have been able to endure monetary policy this tight with fiscal policy this tight without experiencing a very severe recession. So what it shows is a very tough, very resilient economy, which overall is steadily getting stronger, even if living standards have been affected for the short term as a result of a policy error that was made last year.
Yeah, and just maybe for everyday folks here, the economic complaint that I hear all of the time is that wages are stagnant, that this is frustrating for people here. That's the major frustration. That's how they feel about it. Because their disposable income, in the first 8 years of this century, disposable income was really amazing. It was every single year people felt it. Yeah. And when we had the 2008 crisis, the rate of increase for disposable income and wages is never really very much, hasn't completely recovered from that. So, that's an everyday frustration.
Yes. Can I just add, though, that that's also true in the West, which is a point people never seem to remember, which is that if we're talking about Britain, for example, in Britain, people are complaining about stagnant disposable income here also. They're complaining about it in Germany, where I am. And they're blaming, as I said, negative and zero interest rates for it. And they were, until very recently, complaining about it in the United States as well. Except, of course, as Alex and Peter have said, we've had over the last 2 years the Donald Trump sugar rush from the cutting of taxes at the same time as we have had in the United States, a very, very accommodating, a very flexible monetary policy. So Russia is not by any means unique in having a squeeze on disposable income. But, and this is the key difference, there has not been this explosion of credit growth that we have seen in the West. The economics ministry has been complaining recently that personal credit to Russian borrowers increased too much last year, which I mean, which it did. But I mean, already you see steps being taken to sort of cool that down. And at the same time, as I said, the productive parts of the economy, its industries, its factories, its farms, they have been doing better. They have been growing steadily as they are competing more effectively with imported products, both on the Russian domestic market, and I suspect their exports are looking up also.
One of the things that kind of a indication, again, for everyday people, one of the passions that Russians have is, and it's a word in Russian, it's called remont, which means refurbishing, getting a new kitchen, getting a new bathroom, redoing your place. And that sector is really doing well, and that's a positive thing, because people are investing in themselves.
Yes.
And they're looking at the future, and it's something that's very, very important. I'm involved in it myself, and I talk to my interior designer and the workers on my apartment, and there's no shortage of work, and that's a very positive sign for the economy. That's one of the underlining indicators.
Absolutely. I mean, the central bank needs to start moderating its monetary policy. I've been saying this for years.
Yeah, but Alex, let's be fair. I agree with you completely. But when you went through the 1990s, you were scarred deeply.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Deeply. Okay. And I think that this is one of the things that even at the very highest levels in the Kremlin, Putin himself, is that you remembered what happened in the 1990s, and now you get super, super conservative. Like you make sure there's always money in the bank, and you don't have to run to Gazprom and steal their revenue to pay for everything else. That's what they did in the 1990s. Okay.
Or worse still, rock up to the INF, get loans from the INF, which only ended up by making your situation overall worse. And I think that's something that Russia never allowed themselves again.
There's always this debate going on inside the Kremlin, is that when prices of oil are high and very much appreciated, there's always that section, that wing of the power elites that want to spend that surplus big time, okay? Because when you build hospitals and new schools and a new stadium, and it's for the people and all that, and of course a lot of people make money off of it. But then there's that wing that says we don't need it. We're going to keep the money in the bank. We're going to diversify out of dollars, out of euros. We're going to have this and different basket. These are the conservatives. The conservatives that are saying we have to think about tomorrow and the next day, not just the election cycle and making people happy. Pork politics. It doesn't work the same way here, because there are people that just draw the line and say no.
Well, and can I add, you see, because Peter, I'm in a country, Germany, which has had similar scars in the past. Obviously,
there you go.
Further back in history than now. But I mean, one of the reasons why Germany is fiscally conservative and has traditionally been fiscally conservative is why it has consistently saved, why it has had historically positive interest rates, is precisely for the same reason. The Germans also believe in macroeconomic stability above all else.
It's a religion.
It's a religion.
It's a religion.
It is absolutely part of the way people feel here. And it's also part of the way people feel in Russia. Now, I'm going to end with two quick observations. The first one was that I forgot to mention that, of course, as I said, Russian industry is expanding. Industries throughout the West, including in China and in the United States, well, China's not in the West, but in the United States, but also in China, industry has been contracting. Industrial output has been contracting over the last year. In Russia, it has been growing. A fact people tend not to notice because they don't really look at these things. But I once said to a German who knows Russia very well, that what will eventually happen is that with Russia, you will get an economy eventually, German in its rigor and American in its scale. And he actually agreed with me.
That's cool. That's really cool.
Let's get moving on. Some more super chats from No Sense. Peter, assuming Trump is not a total phony, will the U.S. deep state risk losing the empire through a catastrophic rift with an openly globalist EU?
Oh, I don't think that I don't think anybody in Washington takes the EU seriously anymore. Okay, I think what's very interesting is if we look at the American ambassador to Germany, and he threatened, if you don't spend more money on defense, this 2% NATO quota, we'll move our troops. And then the German public opinion poll said, yeah, why don't you move your troops? I mean, poll after poll after poll have shown the Germans want the Americans, if not to leave, to scale down immensely. Okay, so again, this is just this perception of what the EU was so in many ways created, at least idea-wise, by the United States as a front line against the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe. I mean, they wanted to have a centralized or an economy that was integrated, that would support Washington in its efforts during the Cold War, which I think is just fine. It was called the European Economic Community, which I think was great. It's why Europe grew so fast in the post-war period. But this political project that nobody really has been consulted in the EU about, except for people in Brussels. They've thought about this. They want to. There's this belief that they can become a counter to the United States, which of course the United States does not want to have happen. They don't want a competitor. They want someone that is compliant. Okay, that's what they want. All right, and so the view from Washington is what the Europeans. They don't need to talk. They need to listen and do what they're told, and that's very clear in this administration. All right. For me, I mean, if you thought about saving the Western world, and I tend to think that way, then I think the United States should deal with its allies in a more equitable way. I think everybody should pay their fair share. Europe is not poor. Okay, it can pay for these things. But if you pay for things and you decide, and if you're told that you have to pay for it, then you have this tendency, well, I will decide what I want to spend on. Okay, don't tell me that I need to buy your planes and your tanks and your missiles. I mean, if you really want us to spend more money, going back to the German example, they will buy what they want, what they think is important for their defense and for their neighbors. That is in opposition to what Washington wants in the arms industry, okay? They want these countries to buy things they don't need. But if Europe is going to step back and say, okay, we're going to spend more money on defense, then you're going to have a very realistic, cold, sober analysis of what actually threatens Europe. And they will come to one very clear conclusion. It ain't Russia, okay? It's illegal immigration, falling infrastructure. These things threaten the security of the EU. And so the problem here is that there's so very different perceptions. The U.S. cannot conceive of Europe as being an equal. It just has something that it doesn't commute. They kind of even would laugh about that, okay? They have complete disdain for Europe and Europeans, particularly European leaders, because they know, when Slovenia is in and Montenegro is in and Albania is in the EU, they will go for elite capture like they did everywhere else and capture their elites, and then make it divorced from what really the people need. And that's why we have this wave of populism. We have this elite capture by Washington, and these leaders are doing things that have nothing to do with the well-being of the citizens they're supposed to be representing. So, the deep state, they need players. Look at this whole thing with Russiagate. I mean, they were able to activate all these, in the UK and in Italy, they activated their assets to get involved against the Trump campaign. That's how the deep state works that way. They guard their assets, okay? And they're more than willing to overthrow a government or undermine a party. They've been doing that since the Second World War. I mean, Russia meddling in parties in the EU. I'll tell you guys, the Russians wouldn't spend the money. They just wouldn't do. They wouldn't see the payoff, okay? The Americans do it all of the time, as we speak, okay? That's what they do.
All right. Alexander, Peter, yes or no from Penguins fan super chat. Will Russia ever be coming back to the G7 and make it the G8?
No. Why? No, not ever.
Alexander.
I agree with that. I mean, Putin, when he was discussing it with Macron, was incredibly dismissive. And this was at a press conference. And Zaharova, who was the foreign ministry spokesman, was equally dismissive. From the Russian point of view, the G7 has absolutely nothing to offer. Peter said it exactly. It was never a comfortable experience for the Russians being part of the G8. I should add that they were never part of the G7. They were never, what used to happen was that you used to have these two simultaneous summit meetings. There would be the G7 summit meeting, which would be the Western powers. And then
that would be the financial ministers. Russia was never involved in any.
Exactly. And the G8 would be essentially, as I said, at this other level. So they were never really integrated into the system. And I don't think they really liked it anyway. I mean, what used to happen, as I very well remember, was that Putin used to come along to these meetings and all the others used to gang up on him. And I don't really see why he would want to go back to that when, as Peter absolutely rightly said, the G20 works for him so much better and for Russia so much better. Russia doesn't need the G7. I don't think he want anything to do with it.
Okay, super chat from A. Sanchez. Peter, going back to Russia and let's see, the financial situation of Russia. The super chat is, because the borrower is a slave to the lender, Russia's financial policies of amassing gold and eliminating debt are positioning it to be the biggest winner in the next global financial meltdown. Is that true?
Well, I would maybe answer it in a little bit different. I mean, 2008 was seared into the memory and the bottom line of a lot of financial interests in Russia, because they foolishly got themselves involved in the West's toxic financial system. They learned the hard way. Okay, they really did. And as Alexander Makiris has already previously said, is that, you know, these sanctions here are such a blessing in a way, because it made the Russians say, look, we've got a lot of money here, and we need to start making it work for our own country. And again, these oligarchs, as people used to call them, they're just highly paid civil servants. Okay, that's perfectly fine with me. Okay, and so Russia is preparing it. It's insulating itself from the next major financial crisis, and it wants. And I always say this about Putin, and I would say this about Russian policy in general, foreign or domestic, is they always want to have options, and having a large reserve of gold and other precious metals and minerals. Rare earths and things like that. That's an investment in the future. So when something's thrown at you, you can react to it. You have resources to be able to come up with a reaction. Okay, not to be caught flat-footed. So I think that's the reason why they're doing it, and I think it's a very good idea. I mean, I would rather have gold in the bank than to trust Goldman Sachs's derivatives. Sorry, I think that after 2008, so that's common sense.
I would agree with all of this. I would agree. I mean, I don't know to what extent the Russians are looking to leverage any strong position they have in the event of a future financial crisis, but they are certainly doing something which Western economies have never really done, which is prepared for a future financial crisis. And as Peter absolutely rightly says, they have been within living memory through three. They were through a massive crisis in 1991, 92, when the USSR broke up. They went through another massive crisis in 1998, when the ruble collapsed.
I was here.
And Russia defaulted. And they went through another huge crisis in 2008, 2009, which people don't realize it, but it looked like at the time a near-death experience. The stock market was imploding, the ruble was crashing, the government reserves were melting away at a phenomenal speed. And of course, companies, businesses, which had borrowed heavily in Western financial markets, were under extreme stress in the event the reserves, which had already been piled up, proved big enough to get Russia through. But, it was a closer run thing than I think people in the Kremlin and in the financial and economics ministries would be happy with. And they're absolutely determined never to go through anything like that again. And if that means a period of time when living standards grow more slowly, then so be it. It's a long-term decision, which I think, as our listener and viewer correctly said, I think it's a long-term decision which will ultimately work to Russia's benefit.
Okay.
Right, because what they learned is this cheap money from Western financial capitals was a curse. It was a real curse.
Yes.
And that's something. And Alexander Makiris is right. Is that the 2000 crisis is even worse than the previous two in a deep psychological way, because finally the veneer, the invincibility, and the inevitability of Western dominance was shattered forever, because we could never imagine that a crisis of that magnitude would come from the U.S.
Yes.
It's not like Brazil fell off the cliff, or Argentina again, or Indonesia, goes off the cliff. All these crises where you have all these adjustments. But no, this was Wall Street. Okay, this is Lehman Brothers stuff, and it was such a shock. I remember I was here. I had just moved here, and just the shock and the awe in the faces of people. Like, how could Lehman Brothers, that was like an altar that everybody worshipped. I mean, I went there representing a Russian bank to Lehman Brothers. I had a meeting there. It's like, we have to make sure that they're happy with us. Let's have all our data and all these reports. And the Lehman brother, I remember her name was Barbara, and she was so arrogant. And the Russians were trembling in their boots. Okay. Yes. A few months later, it's gone. It was very interesting. It was a psychological shock, and they've learned. That's the most important lesson, is to believe that they can fail. We will survive. We will survive. Yes. They won't.
Okay, super chat from Fred Elliott, $20. Thank you, Fred, for that super chat. And from Neurosurgery Highland, super chat. I would say to both of you guys, what is the story with Byrne, the CEO of Overstock? You guys heard about this story? Sarah Carter actually wrote up an article about the Overstock CEO. I think he was, correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, guys, but I think he was dating Maria Butina.
Yeah.
And I mean, I got some stuff to talk about with Russiagate and stuff like that. So I don't know if you guys have any comment on it.
Well, he was in a remarkable fashion of honesty. He made the FBI, or the authorities, I don't know if it was directly the FBI, that he was involved with this young woman, and he basically turned against her and worked for the states. And I think he had
was it Maria Butina though?
Yeah,
it was her.
And so he basically became an asset. And I mean, here's a guy that this generation of stargazers, idealistic kids from Silicon Valley, that we're going to make the world great. We're going to change the way people think and trade. And all of a sudden, he realized he's just the tool. And I don't understand his letter very well. There was so much to read this morning, but I did come across it. It was on Zero Hedge. You saw it too. But I just think that was more of a sign of remorse. But of course, the company was very, very embarrassed by the whole thing. I mean, people in those positions are not supposed to say deep state like we say deep state, okay? I mean, who knows what kind of contracts companies like that have with the deep state? And I'm willing to wager that all of these companies have contacts with the deep state, okay? So he was kind of moved the curtain away just for a little light to shine in, and then it was closed off real quick, okay? I don't want to go into real details, but I think that's the gist of the story.
Yes, I mean, as I understand it, he's not the only person who was dating Maria Butina, who was basically spying on her. And the extraordinary thing about all of that...
He was spying on her, Alexander?
Spying on her, informing on her. This is what I understand about this. And what is interesting about all of this is that apparently they were all reporting in the end to the US authorities. Actually, there's nothing there. This person, Maria Butina, is not...
She loved guns and she loved America. Her two great sins.
Exactly. There was nothing sinister or unusual or illicit in anything that she was doing. And apparently that simply wasn't believed. And we had this extraordinary prosecution brought against her, which was a shameful prosecution, in which she was basically coerced into pleading guilty because she was running out of money. And as a result, I think she's still in prison. I don't think she's yet returned to...
Alexander, I guess during her trial, things were being mentioned,
Yeah.
conversations that she had with people. And I bet you my bottom dollar, she was probably sitting there as a defendant and realizing people that she thought were honest and nice, good American people.
Yes.
And when the evidence was shown to her, she probably realized who said what and who betrayed her. That must have been a crushing moment for her. I mean, she was in graduate school in the United States. She wanted an advanced degree. She wanted to bring guns to Russia, okay?
Yeah.
Which it was actually, she did create a bit of a, she ruffled feathers here in social media in the Russian language because of her attachment to guns, which Russia has a very completely different gun culture than the United States. So it must have been a crushing moment for her to realize that what she genuinely thought she was doing something good for everybody involved, that everybody in the end turned on her. It must have been crushing. My goodness.
There's another super chat from Barb Turner. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, which is also Patrick Byrne resignation and his Russiagate story. Guys, Alexander, how did Maria Butina hook up with these powerful people? They sought her out. Patrick, I mean, this is a girl that's studying in the U.S. and here she is dating the CEO of Overstock.
Well, I mean, it does seem extraordinary. Actually,
I mean, extraordinary. I'm sorry.
She must have been the most.
Doesn't add up here.
No, well, it doesn't maybe it doesn't add up. I mean, I suspect that she was able to leverage some of her contacts with the NRA to get admissions into all sorts of people. She seems to have been an extremely busy networker, and people can network.
But that's what Western culture teaches everyone to do. Yeah. I don't know about you guys, but there isn't a day that doesn't go by that I don't get a message somehow. Peter, can you introduce me to this person and this person? And most of the time I don't even answer because I have no idea who you are. Okay. So, I mean, this culture of networking is something that is very much promoted. She seemed to be quite enamored with it because it looked like it was yielding results. Was she entrapped? I don't know. I don't have the evidence for that. One might want to make that supposition, but it does seem kind of strange. You know, once some of these doors started opening, some other doors opened up easily and quickly. Who knows? Okay. I know, Alexander Christopher, I know where you're coming from on this. Okay. I want to be very conservative, but I get your point.
Yeah. It's just such an incredible story for someone that came from Russia just to study in the US. And all of a sudden she's exposed to all these people.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think it's.
I wonder what kind of conversations you'd have with Carter Page or George Papadopoulos. I mean, that would be such a great crosstalk.
Yeah, I mean, it's just incredible. And Alexander, we've done the programs with, like Peter said, with Papadopoulos and the Mark Stein and the whole dangle operations that took place.
Absolutely.
And here you have Maria Butina, who's just caught up in all of this stuff.
Well, indeed. Well, Alex, I am sure there's lots of questions to answer. The one thing I would say about Maria Butina is that she was not apparently an unknown person in Russia. Her advocacy of gun culture had attracted quite a lot of attention. And
criticism.
And a lot of criticism. And she was a fairly well-known gun activist in Russia. Now, she might have been able to leverage that to some extent to get some kind of contacts within the NRA. And she might have been able to leverage those contacts to meet with some other people. Now, whether, as I said, she was herself the victim of some kind of elaborate entrapment exercise, or whether, more was going on than we know, I think we'll have to wait and see. But all I would say is that the US authorities had every opportunity to make a strong case against her, and in the end weren't able to. The only thing they could come up with was this FARA abuse, the FARA violation. So as I said, it doesn't seem as if she was, which I don't take seriously, by the way, which doesn't seem as if she herself was up to anything sinister. Whether other people might have been, I simply don't know.
Well,
Okay.
we might find out when she finally comes
Yeah.
back to Russia. Then she'll be able to tell her side of the story.
Incredible
Exactly.
story.
Yeah.
Super chat from Sparky. Negative interest rates leave investors with little incentive to flee to bonds. World economy collapses, leaving America as the refugee and beneficiary. Any comment on that statement from Sparky?
Well, I think this is a view that one often hears, that, you know, the United States is self-sufficient, that the dollar will remain the reserve currency, that there will be what is called a flight to quality, that is to say, a flight to the dollar, that when the world financial system implodes, the US will come out of it stronger than it was before. Now, I'm going to say two things. Firstly, I am one of those people who believes that the United States, for the foreseeable future, irrespective of whether there's a recession or a crash, I believe that the United States will remain a major center of economic and political power in the world. It is still a huge and very rich country with immense science and technology and great industries. But I think this idea that the United States would come out the winner if the entire world economy imploded in some way, or the world financial system imploded in some way, is extraordinarily complacent and wishful thinking. It is the United States is at the center of the world financial system. If the financial system breaks down, that will have very negative repercussions on the United States and, in the long run, on the position of the dollar. And I think that any other view is an exercise in denial.
Absolutely. And what it is, what I think, again, I'm kind of going with my mantra here, is that if there is a major crisis, even use the word collapse, that may be the only thing to shake the US and its elites out of this exceptionalism and start looking inward and start rebuilding the country. And I think that would be the only positive thing that would come out of it. But, you know, let's not fool ourselves, you guys. The elites in the West are prepared for everything. They'll come out as a winner. The rest of us will be flushed. Okay. It's the way it always works.
All right. Super chat from Sparky, following up on that previous super chat. Talking down the economy when recession seems imminent has the effect of staving off said recession. It encourages people to take precautions.
But see, this is some kind of propaganda strategy that's being played out there. I've noticed that I've been pointing it out over the last few weeks because I've had time on my hands. There's this. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if you're telling people there's going to be recession, then you start taking precautions, and that means you may not make economic decisions that you otherwise would have. And again, it creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that there's some kind of crisis. And I think it's a real mixed bag right now. But I'm not putting all my money into gold certificates. Okay, but there are concerning issues out there. I stick with the one with agriculture. I think because it really is so painful for so many people in the Midwest. But the questioner is absolutely right. I mean, the more you talk about it, the more you prepare for it. And the more you prepare for it, the more possibility it's going to happen.
Alexander, any comments on that?
Well, I've always taken the view myself, and this is, I know, an exercise in naivety, that the best way to deal with an economy is to say it exactly as it is, or as it appears to you. Not to talk it down, not to talk it up, but to describe it realistically. And realistically, there are growing problems in the United States. There is a growing problem of uncontrolled credit emission there, which has been going on for a long time, by the way.
Very long time.
A very long time. And one other way of looking at this phenomenon of negative interest rates or zero interest rates, and of course Donald Trump, as I'm talking, is agitating apparently about the need for the Federal Reserve Board to bring down interest rates even more and to start quantitative easing all over again. The reason we are seeing negative interest rates is the financial system is becoming waterlogged. It is finding itself full of too much money at a time when, because of suppressed demand, through the clampdown on disposable income, there is no scope for raising consumer prices. So you have far too much money at the top end of the system, and some of it's going into bonds, some of it is going into stocks and shares and all of these things, which have reached stratospheric levels, some of which is going into property, but an expression of this is, as we see, negative interest rates in other countries, because as I said, there's an excess of cash out there. But having said all of that, you can talk about these things, you can prepare for them. I don't see much sign of preparation. I don't see much sign of preparation on the part of consumers. I don't see much sign of preparation on the part of governments. On the contrary, all I am seeing coming from the authorities, from the central banks, from governments, is more of the same. And that's perhaps the worst sort of thing you can do.
Okay, another super chat from Sparky. China and Russia's upcoming common gold-backed trading currency will have them sitting pretty in the next world recession.
Well, again, we'll have to wait and see. I think that China is still very heavily integrated into the world economy. And we must not forget the fact that China is, unlike Russia, is not a self-sufficient continental economy in the way that Russia is, and in the way that the United States was. It has to import raw materials. It has to import food. Russia doesn't. Russia can go along without those things if it has to. So, if there is a world economic crisis, a global recession of the kind of magnitude that some people are talking about, China will suffer. But again, I think that just as the Russians have been working very hard over the last 10 years to prepare their economy for in case anything like that happens, I think the Chinese have also come to see that the country they need to get close to if they're going to come through a global crash, because it can provide them with the raw materials, the energy and the food that they need, but which wouldn't be able to import if there was some bigger crisis, is Russia. And that's why you see these two countries, their economies coming together in the way that they are. I think there is a misunderstanding about this, by the way. I think people imagine this to be a very lopsided relationship with China as the overwhelmingly dominant partner. China is a much bigger economy and a much bigger country than Russia in population terms. But in reality, because of the differences in the way those two economies are structured and the different strengths each have, they complement each other very well. They have synergies. Synergy is exactly the right word.
And another thing here is the biggest question is really the dollar here. And the Chinese and the Russians have really woken up into that. I mean, they're looking to use their own currencies and with other, bypassing the dollar. See, this is their long-term strategy. And it's not going to happen fast. No. A crisis could make it happen fast, okay? But the dollar is going to be around for a long time. Yes. The question is, what percentage of all global exchanges will be in the dollar? And it is on the decline, and it will continue on the decline. Yes. And there will be a certain tipping point where the dollar isn't. Trump really lost his temper, I guess it was like last week or something like that, about the role of the dollar. Yes. Anyone that wants to look at the future of the global economy, and I would say to build instability, not instability, but to have stability, create stability, is this diversification away from the dollar. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. Okay, because we've seen how the U.S. has abused the dollar, turned it into a political weapon, and that is its single cardinal mistake. Because when you do that, you undermine confidence, and if you don't have confidence in the currency, it's over.
Absolutely.
Super chat from Laura Clotworthy, $14.99 USD. Thank you very much, Laura. And from Sparky, a super chat. Peter, you mentioned it as we started this program. The U.S. should trade Denmark's NATO debt for Greenland. The Greenland story.
No, I don't think so. No, we said in the beginning when the United States purchased Alaska from Russia, There was talk of buying Greenland at that time. During the Truman administration, there was also talk about buying Greenland, and that was with a focus on the Cold War. And they're rare earths, those minerals that are very, very important, and Greenland has it. But you don't really do things that way, okay? I mean, for the optics of it outside of the United States, it's so burlesque, it's so grotesque, okay, that you just want to buy it. I mean, and it's almost as if you have to sell it because we want to buy it. That's just again a violation of sovereignty. I'm not saying it's impossible to happen, and if it's going to happen, it has to happen in a different way. This looks like extortion. I mean, it doesn't look good from the outside looking in. Really, I mean, Alex Crispore, I was messaging you a couple days ago. I said, what a strange story. I mean, I couldn't believe when I saw on the Twitter feed. I said, Greenland? Really? Okay.
There's a method to his madness, though. We'll figure it out. I think there is a method to his madness. But
that will make you, you're going to be the first PhD in Donald Trump studies, okay? And you'll get an endowed chair, okay? Okay. Trump studies. Okay.
Not a bad gig. All right. From Bernard Hutchinson, staying on Trump, Peter, for both of you guys, yes or no, can Trump win in 2020 with or without a recession?
I think he can win without a recession. I think with a recession, it will be a lot tougher. But the Democrats are doing everything they can. They're working overtime to make his election easier. And they are still clinging on to the straws of Russiagate that are still floating on the surface, and a lot of their policies. I mean, I have to say, I think this Green New Deal that they seem to be, a lot of them seem to be signing up to, seem to me is going to really lose a lot of credibility for any Democratic candidate going into that election. So, as I said, I think the Democrats are not playing this well, and none of their candidates looks to me remotely like a winner. I mean, I think Trump would have Joe Biden for breakfast, quite frankly. I think Bernie Sanders' day has passed. I think Elizabeth Warren, frankly, I saw her described somewhere as another version, a slightly less unpleasant version of Hillary Clinton. And I basically agree. And I can't really see who else there is. I mean, I can't imagine any of these people, bar a recession or a major failure in foreign policy, making a big impact on Trump. But then, I live in Europe. I'm not an American, so maybe I've got this wrong.
I think one of the things that's really quite interesting, and it was Robert Mary in an article recently, I think it was Robert Mary, in the American Conservative, and he made one point. He brought up a lot of points, and we always mention them during these podcasts. But he did say something to me I thought was really. He wrote something that I thought was very interesting. Is that Trump has really not been able to attract people beyond his base. And that is very different, let's say, from like Ronald Reagan. Yeah. Ronald Reagan was, I can even remember very clearly, Democrats for Reagan. Remember those days, okay? Yeah. He was able to cross borders and cross the aisle. And Trump has not really been able to do that. Now, having said all this, I'll go back to what I said earlier. It's all about the Electoral College. I mean, you have to look at states. If you're looking at just the public opinion, and the popular vote, then Al Gore would have been president. Okay, Hillary Clinton would have been president. Yes. Okay, and so it really gets down to certain states, and it was designed that way, and I think it really smartly designed that way as well. So we have to look at that. Look at the states he won, and look how he's doing in each one of those states, and that will give you a really good indication. Let's forget about this, chorus show that's being, I mean, it's CNN and MSNBC making tons of money on it, okay? I mean, advertising, all that. They, the racist tight and double digit, and it's all propaganda. It's all nonsense, you guys, okay? It's a show. They're putting on a show. It's a beauty pageant, okay? Yes. And there's mindless hour after hour after hour mindless nonsense. Okay, I don't watch it. Okay, I let Tucker Carlson explain it to me. To be honest with you, it's only 1 hour. Less than 1 hour, 5 days a week. That's a good investment. That's a really good investment.
Okay, super chat from Sparky. Hillary's ruination of Africa's future through her destruction of Libya will make the Chinese conquest of Africa much easier. Is that true, Alexander?
Well,
they were already there. They were there way before that. So
I wouldn't use words like conquest, actually. I think these are loaded words. I think the Chinese are going to be big in Africa. They have lots of economic and financial interests there. They've invested in many things. They built infrastructure there. They're involved in developing all kinds of resources there. And I think they will continue to be involved in Africa for a very long time, because they offer African governments and African states very good deals. And I think that will continue, irrespective of what the United States does. I think it is the US that looks at Chinese economic involvement in Africa in geopolitical terms. I don't think the Chinese do.
I agree with that completely. Look, the AFRICOM, it's the United States is militarizing the continent. The Chinese are building infrastructure. Who's ultimately going to be the winner there? I think it's so obvious.
Yeah.
Okay, from Penguins fan Peter, update on Hong Kong. Will China intervene in Hong Kong?
If necessary, of course. It's its own territory. Yeah. It's part of China.
Yeah.
It's a national security issue. Absolutely. Absolutely. This attempted color revolution is it's a sham. It's absolute a sham, and again, watching Western media coverage of it is this appalling. It's so propagandistic. Yeah. Okay, but I don't think the Chinese, if you're talking about the People's Liberation Army, I don't think it's necessary. I think the police will take care of it itself inside of Hong Kong. Yeah. I think that's it. Okay.
Yeah. My own feeling about this, and now I may be completely wrong, is that the protest movement in Hong Kong is actually beginning to ebb. Now, the last protest did not attract the 1.7 million people that the organizers claimed, and it certainly, and which some sections of the Western media claimed also, which is ridiculous. In fact, it looked to me significantly smaller than some of the earlier protests. And I suspect that what has happened is that the violence and extremism
turned a lot of people off.
Exactly, of some of the protesters is now starting to trigger a backlash. So I suspect, I mean, I may be wrong about this, but I sort of getting the feeling that the sort of peak period of this protest movement is over. And I'm going to add something else, which is that I suspect also that the open interference of Western governments in this affair has also, if I'm right in that assessment, is also playing a role, because of course an awful lot of people in Hong Kong are perfectly aware of what's going on, and they do not want to be used as cannon fodder in some great geopolitical exercise.
They have so much to. They have so much to lose.
They have everything to lose. They have absolutely everything to lose. They have no interest in seeing Hong Kong go smash, and I think that that's probably going to be, especially to benefit some scribblers in Washington, London, and Paris, and those places. So I think that all of this is probably already starting to trigger a swing. And I think the airport occupations, which were frankly appalling episodes with great violence through them, and as I said, mistreatment of people who were taken hostage, I think the airport episodes have been decisive. And though I think the protest movement probably has still some way to go before it completely sputters out, I think the peak may have passed.
All right. From Sparky, Super Chat, the brave and courageous Macron will lead his EU army in a giant cavalry charge, taking over Russia, Asia, then the world. Maniacal laughter.
Well, I think even Monsieur Macron might not be quite such a lost to such Napoleonic delusions. But I have to say, listening to the way he was talking, first to Putin and then to Boris Johnson, but especially to Putin, I mean, it seemed to me that the words folie de grandeur certainly did come to mind.
From Lord Brett Sinclair, super chat.
No, but it's really interesting. Macron is just trying to be relevant. Okay, I mean, he really is playing to the crowd. Okay, I mean, he is really such a quintessential example of bred in circuses. Okay, I mean, just buffoonish behavior. I mean, my God, when's the last time it was a leader of stature in Europe? Really?
Well, again, France is a country I know well. And as I said, French people look to their leaders for both dignity and realism. I mean, France is a country has always had a very, very strong tradition of realism, raison d'etat.
De Gaulle.
Even beyond de Gaulle. So they've always looked for leaders like that. And I think when they hear Macron talking in the way that he does to Putin, I don't think it goes down at all well. I mean, this endless recitation about human rights when everybody in France knows about what's been happening with the yellow vests. And this constant lecturing of Putin about Russia being this great European country, and these invocations of Dostoevsky and Turgenev and Stravinsky and whoever. I don't think French people like that kind of thing very much. What they like are tough, realistic, even perhaps slightly cynical and worldly diplomacy. That's the French tradition. And Macron doesn't really conform to it at all.
All right, we're 10 minutes over 2 hours now on this live stream.
Yeah, I only have a few minutes left on my battery phone.
Let's get moving. And guys, remember, hit that like button, share the channel. Let's get moving on the super chats. From Lord Brett Sinclair, I think the EU will give way on the backstop at the last minute and allow Boris to present May's surrender treaty as a viable option. Alexander.
I don't think so. I think they boxed themselves in with the backstop. I mean, Macron, who, as we said, talks lots of nonsense, lots of the time, has said that the backstop is basically non-negotiable. Merkel, who has the option who has the power, if she ever wanted to use it, to move beyond the question of the backstop, threw the problem back into Boris Johnson's hands. I think the EU is trapped on the backstop. They did exactly the same mistake, by the way, during the Ukrainian crisis, when there was the European Association Agreement. And the Ukrainians came along and they said, look, this simply isn't going to work. If you're going to push us to adopt this, it will ruin our economic links with Russia and precipitate a crisis, all of which was obviously true. And the European Union responded, we're not going to negotiate over a single dot or comma. And they didn't. And sure enough, the crisis came.
Okay, super chat from Jay Walker. Can we have Claire Caw on as a guest next week? Claire Caw, Claire Shaw. Have her send us an email. Answer I can give. From Penguins fan, super chat. Update on South Africa farm seizures. Do we have an update on South Africa?
I haven't heard much about this story for a long time. I mean, there's been a change of president in South Africa, and Ramaphosa seemed very, very keen on this idea. Whether he's moderated his views on it, I don't know. But frankly, I think the situation in South Africa has been far from good for a very long time. And everything I'm hearing about the country is that things are steadily getting worse. So, I mean, I can't say more than make those very general comments.
Okay, because let's see, Penguins fan has a follow-up to that. Is it true that Russia is taking white South African farmers?
Well, I think what the Russians said is that if anybody wants to come to Russia from wherever it is and wants to establish themselves in the farm because obviously Russia wants to develop its farming sector, then they're welcome. And Afrikaners, white South Africans, are some of the world's best farmers. And apparently some of them have been interested in coming to Russia for that purpose. And if they did come, I'm sure the Russians would welcome them. I know British farmers in Russia who are doing very well, apparently. So why not South Africans? I think that the Russians are keen to have anybody who wants to come and help them develop their huge country and its agricultural resources, and who has the skills to do it. I think they would welcome them from wherever they can.
Ditto, absolutely.
All right, from Lord Brett Sinclair, super chat. Robin Tilbrook case has been thrown out by a well-documented Remainer judge. Many believe that British judiciary is compromised. Comments?
Well, I read the original. I haven't heard about this late. If this is a new decision, I'm sorry. I know that it was refused the first time round on paper, and the judge at that time said that it had that it was wholly without merit. I have to say, I didn't think so. But I thought that, it did have merit, at least for an argument. But let's be frank about this. It always had huge problems, and they were political problems, to my mind, rather than legal ones. Because to say, as Robin Tilbrook was saying, that Britain actually quit the EU on the 29th of March, and what has been happening since is, somehow an illusion because we've actually already left the EU, is to ask an awful lot of a judge to agree, bearing in mind that the type of claim that Robin Tilbrook was bringing is judicial review, which, as the English lawyers say, is discretionary. In other words, you may have a cast iron legal case, but if the court in the end decides that in the public interest it shouldn't be heard, then they have that option. Mm-hmm. Now, if it has been conclusively thrown out, I would be sorry, because I did think that Robin Tilbrook did make some actually very valid legal points.
Okay, from Steve P. Peter, will Trump get the U.S. out of the neocon liberal wars?
No. Mm-hmm. His plan is not to make them worse. That's a pathetic position, but that's his. Okay. Yeah. He is not meddling in their designs around the world. He just makes it very clear. I have to wonder if he does like the Johnson effect. He grabs people by the collars and say, just don't get it worse. Do what you want. Don't make it worse. I have a feeling that's what he's like when it comes to these things. Look, 3 years in, he's shown very little interest. He's shown very little learning. He's just lazy. He's one of these gamma guys. He's not an alpha. He's a gamma. He's just focused on one or two things, and that's the only thing he wants to focus in on. He just all his energy goes into that.
Well, at this moment in time, his overriding priority is to get re-elected.
Yeah.
I mean, 2020 is not far off now. So he's going to do everything he possibly can to get himself re-elected. That means he doesn't want to start any wars, because that would offend and upset his electoral base. And I think he's going to try and end one war, which is Afghanistan, which frankly, even within the US, many people are quietly agreeing isn't going anywhere. I suspect that at some point he might try to ramp down on Syria also. I mean, he tried last year.
I think Afghanistan and Syria, that will be his crowning moment. Withdrawal, not complete withdrawal, but significant, and it will show that he kept his word. Okay, exactly. I think that's what's going on there.
Exactly. But I think that the very last thing he wants at this moment in time is a gigantic battle with the neocon foreign policy, defense, security establishment. I think he's seen the damage it can do, and I don't think he wants to take them on head on just a few months before an election.
Well, the interesting thing is here, and I only have a few minutes left because I'm using my phone here. It was mentioned, but we didn't discuss it. These investigations into the investigators. It will be very interesting, the timing when Barr and others come up with their results. Trump will use that as a cudgel to be able to get rid of a lot of people that he doesn't want to have around, that's not on his agenda, okay,
Absolutely.
Whatever that agenda is. But it's look at the political fallout from those reports, because that's going to be exactly what any kind of leader that feels like that he's been betrayed by his own administration, he will be able to strike in, and he'll be able to strike with good reason, and he'll have a lot of sympathy for it, a lot of sympathy. So Trump, as wily as he is, I'm sure he's waiting, and I'm sure there are people giving him counsel, say, if you want to get rid of these people, you want to make, be a mover and a shaker, wait for these reports, because you're going to use them as political capital. And that will also be part of his re-election campaign.
I agree.
Okay. We've got 3 super chats from Penguins fan on Syria, Idlib, and Turkey Erdogan. So I'm going to read all 3 of them. And looks like Peter. Well, there's Peter and Mr. Vladimir Putin there.
Okay.
So there's Peter.
My phone is telling me
I'm going to connect.
down.
We'll try to get through as many of the super chats as we can. Let's see, where are we? Okay. So the first super chat from Penguins fan is update on Idlib, Syria. The second one is Turkey envoy was hit in Syria and what Erdogan is going to do next. And following up on that, what is the reason that Erdogan picked a fight with Assad in Syria, and what has Assad ever done to Erdogan that he got involved in Syria?
Right. I mean, if we deal firstly with Idlib, we actually did a video on this. I mean, we have seen a Syrian offensive in the south of Idlib, and it's now captured the important town of Khan Shaykhun. And of course, the attempt by the Turkish military to set up an observation post in Khan Shaykhun to prevent it falling to the Syrian military was stopped as a result of a Syrian Air Force airstrike. So,
or maybe Russian, or Russian. We don't know.
Maybe Russian.
We don't know. We don't know.
Well, indeed, we don't know. But I mean, this is an important development. It apparently makes the position of jihadi fighters in northern Hama, which is the adjoining province to the south of Idlib, untenable. And of course, it increases, it brings the Syrian government closer to that position where it finally recovers the whole of Idlib. But I think it's important to stress that this was a limited offensive, basically to clear out jihadi fighters from where they could still pose dangers to the Syrian government in its own key areas in places like northern Hama. And also, it's intended to open one of the main roads from southern Syria to Aleppo, which the jihadis in Khan Shaykhun have still been able to keep closed. So this is not, I think, the final offensive to clear Idlib province. That is what it was. Now, what will Erdogan do in response to this? Well, first of all, he suffered an unquestionable setback because he's sort of presented himself as, in some ways, the protector of Idlib province. But at the end of the day, it seems to me that he's not in a position to do very much. I don't think he's in a position to quarrel with the Russians at this time. The Turkish economy is looking shaky. It was rescued from a financial crash by a $1 billion loan it got from China, which did not receive a lot of attention at the time, but apparently was absolutely key in helping the central bank stabilize the situation with the lira at a critical time. And I don't think Erdogan, annoyed as he probably is with what has happened in southern Idlib, realistically can do very much about it. I predict that there will be more negotiations between the Russians and the Turks. Putin and Erdogan will no doubt meet. Something more will be agreed. There will be more discussions about how Turkish concerns can be satisfied, but step by step, incrementally, more and more of Idlib will fall under Syrian government control.
And what do you bet these guys that slowly withdraw, these jihadists and their followers, when they withdraw from Idlib, we find that they end up in Libya? Mark my words.
Well, indeed. I'm sure you're right, Peter. I'm sure you're right. Now, what did Erdogan think he was doing when he backed the war against Bashar al-Assad? Well, Bashar al-Assad did nothing against him. I mean, Assad has never posed any kind of threat to Turkey or indeed to Erdogan. It was entirely the other way around. In fact, as I understand it, one of the reasons that the Syrian government fell into crisis in 2012 was because they'd relied on Erdogan to keep the border peaceful. And they had not anticipated that Erdogan would throw his weight so decisively behind the war against Assad as he did. Now, why did Erdogan do it? I think for a mix of reasons. Firstly, I think he thought it would be easy. I think, like a lot of people, he thought Assad was going to fall and that the Americans were going to be out to get him. And to get Assad. And I think he thought that if he backed the winning side, as he thought in Syria, he would be able to get benefits for Turkey. I think he also had to take into account Islamist feeling within Turkey as the leader of an Islamist party. And this was an Islamist rebellion against Bashar al-Assad. But I also think the overarching thing is that Erdogan has long hankered after this idea of Turkey as this great regional power in the neo-Ottomanism in the Eastern Mediterranean, dominating the eastern coastlines, bringing in places like Syria and Iraq into some kind of relationship with Turkey. And of course, this is a policy, a program far beyond Turkey's strength and completely contrary to its interests. But I think he was very committed to it. And I think he still is, by the way.
Okay, guys, a super chat from Penguins fan. Do you guys have an update on Kashmir? Have you read anything on what's going on in Kashmir?
Well, I have had a flood of emails and things from various people who are obviously much more familiar with the situation in Kashmir than I am. I would say that most of them are very critical of the Indian government's decision. I am not an expert on the Kashmir conflict. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all of this material that I'm getting. I mean, there have been floods and floods of it, including from an Indian academic of my acquaintance. And I'm going to try and get up to speed. And then maybe we should do a proper video on this. But until I've really digested all of this properly, I think I'm not going to say. And I've not heard that anything specific is happening there, though obviously relations between India and Pakistan are getting much worse.
Well, I'll just say, and again, I'm not an expert on it either, but I'm keenly interested. All I can say at this point in time, unilateral moves on the part of the Indian government, nothing good will come of it in the end. Nothing.
Okay, Penguins fan, Peter, Ukraine, where is it heading as a country?
You know, one of my favorite things to say about Ukraine isn't going east, it isn't going west, it's staying right where it is, and it will always be right where it is. It's still early days. Zelensky, I haven't heard much coming out of him and his government and his successful parliamentary campaigns in elections. No real update. But of course, Ukraine is of a keen importance to us here on this podcast. So when there's an update, I'll let you know, but nothing really new right now.
My impression is one of drift, actually. Zelensky won the presidency and basically on a program of ending corruption, restoring the economy and bringing peace. And he's made certain comments, but nothing very much has happened to achieve any one of those objectives. At the moment, he seems to be very bogged down in trying to get some kind of a negotiation underway with the French and the Germans through the Normandy format. But the problem is that though he talks peace, he talks about wanting peace, he doesn't seem able or willing to make any of the necessary concessions. And I'm afraid they will have to be concessions in order to secure that peace. One of those necessary concessions being to accept once and for all that Crimea is not coming back to Ukraine.
Yeah, well, the thing is that I like this kind of stasis, the static that's going on, is because Zelensky has the levers of power, at least nominally, but he still has to look over his shoulder. You know, remember we had that media bridge between civil society groups in Russia and Ukraine where they're going to do this before the election and just average people talk to each other. That was shot down like, you know, really, that was like the Hindenburg. That really burned and crashed. Okay, there's people still in important places of influence that don't want reconciliation. And so Zelensky's problem is not Russia. It's there are elements in the political elite and the financial elite that he has to deal with. That's his real problem, not Russia.
All right, from Colin Foster, Koch brother dying, hooray, helps Venezuela, question mark. Does it help Venezuela?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this story.
One of the Koch brothers died just before.
Brothers, one of the Koch brothers, okay.
I think David Koch.
Yeah, David. I think it is, yeah.
David. Yeah.
No, you know, I don't know about Venezuela, but, you know, I read the obituary, a quick one right before we started, and, you know, this influencer on in the Republican Party on the political right. I mean, no, he was a globalist, okay? He was for open borders and things like that. I don't like this caricature, okay? I mean, he was in it for himself and his other 1%ers. That's what it was all about. The way, being, you know, this herald is this great conservative. He wasn't conservative. He was not conservative on every single issue. So, and I'm not going to pour scorn. The man is dead, okay? Let's let his family and digest that, because I'm really not part of this new trend now to you know, tear everyone down in the most disgusting way, and we have to get away from that. We could even do a separate video on his legacy, but do it dispassionately and not with so much anger and hate, because I don't want to participate in that culture.
Yeah. As for Venezuela, I'm afraid I don't think he's going to make this.
No. He was involved with some of the quote unquote NGOs and stuff like that. Like, you know. Okay.
But there'll be
nothing new. Nothing new.
Exactly, but there'll be other people. I mean, the policy on Venezuela is now there. The only thing that's going to change over time is, as I said, if Venezuela is able to endure, pull itself together again, and it's not going to happen without the support of the Eurasian powers. And we're not going to see any slackening of US policy. The death of one man is not going to change the policy now. And I think we should be clear about this.
I agree. These policies are bigger than the Kochs and even the Soros. These policies, they're much bigger than these guys.
And the Koch brothers are mythologized by so many different people for a variety of reasons as well.
Yes.
Yeah. And Penguins fan also had a super chat on David Koch. Says, David Koch dead. What's your reaction? What's your reaction on the Koch brothers? I think you guys just answered that as far as that goes. And maybe we will do a separate video on them.
At some point. Why not? Indeed. They're interesting people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Alex, it's 2.5 hours.
We're moving. We still have a few more super chats. We still have a spheres and we're going to be done. Helgvad, super chat for 200 DKK. Thank you for that. And a super chat from Penguins fan. The group Antifa, how they are everywhere. Will this group ever form in Russia, or does the Kremlin tolerate something like that?
I don't think Russian society would tolerate something like that.
Thank you, Alex, for saying that, because Russians wouldn't tolerate it, irrespective of what the government's attitude was. No, average Russian people wouldn't take this seriously, and they'd be very, very angry, and they'd say, what are the police doing about it? Full stop.
Full stop.
Russia has had enough chaos. Groups like that would show up, I mean, they would be shown the train station or the airport. Get out.
All right. From Patik68, super chat. Could you please post the live chats on SoundCloud? Yes, I will. Good idea. From Megawatt, super chat, 10 euros. Thank you very much. From Penguins fan, update on Iranian tanker that just sailed from Gibraltar. And it was supposed to be in Greece. I don't know what happened with that.
No, it's a mystery because we don't quite know where it's going, and we don't know where it's going to stop or if it's going to stop anywhere. The United States made all kinds of threatening noises to Greece that it didn't want the supertanker to refuel in Greece.
Did it refuel in the end?
No, it didn't. As I understand it, it didn't go anywhere near Greece. So, and of course, there's an American warrant out for its arrest, and we will see whether or not the US, through its very, very powerful naval forces in the Mediterranean, does anything to try and seize it. But all I will say about this episode of the tanker is what a disastrous episode it has been. The British have been humiliated by it. They seized this tanker and then they had to release it as a result of the court order. And in the meantime, one of their own ships has been taken. So the British have been badly humiliated by this affair. The United States has been exposed as a bully, putting pressure on its allies. And all this over one tanker. I mean, it's so disproportionate and so misguided. And we come back to some of the points that Peter was making earlier in the program.
That's why I wanted the unhinged world, right?
It's unhinged. It's completely unhinged. I mean, at the end of the day, Assad will get his oil, if that's what this is all about. He's going to get his oil. I mean, he'll get his oil from Iran. What would happen is that the Iranians would supply oil to the Russians, who would in turn supply oil to Syria. They're not going to let Syria fall because of an oil embargo, which can't be enforced. And going around seizing tankers, breaking international law, infringing on the interests of the European Union, or rather
piracy.
It's piracy, exactly. It's completely misconceived. It reminds me of that extraordinary act that happened some months ago when that North Korean embassy was stormed. I mean, again, apparently with US knowledge. And again, I mean, it's
during the summit.
During the summit, again, a bizarre thing to do. And it does really make one wonder about the sort of people who are running things in Washington.
You know, but that's one of the reasons why I wanted to call it Unhinged World, because nobody's listening to the United States when it came to that tanker. It's like they're brushing it off. It's like, this is absolutely absurd what you want us to do. And no one is listening. People are not shaking in their boots. And this is a telling sign. This is a trend. Okay? When you have no apparent logical reason for your behavior, people begin to question your rationality and your psychological state. All right. I mean, the folks in Gibraltar is like, what? Huh? This is an act of piracy. Of course, they didn't say that, but that's what they meant. That's why they ordered it released. Yeah. Okay. Yes. And people are not shaking their boots over an American warrant. So that wasn't the case not long ago. Now it is.
Well, indeed.
All right. A super chat from Michael, SEK50, Syria, question mark. Do you guys have anything to add about Syria?
Well, not over and above what we've said. As I said, incrementally, the Syrian government is expanding its influence in Idlib. The situation with the Kurds and the United States and Turkey remains unresolved. And the US had to put great pressure on Turkey to stop a Turkish attack on the Kurds. And there's this little isolated garrison of US troops in Al-Tanf near the Jordanian border, where they're not really doing anything very much. I think sooner or later, despite some of the extremely harsh language that's coming out of some people in Washington, there will be a retreat from Syria by the US, because really this game is lost. And I think just to pretend that it isn't and to try and impose silly embargoes will end up in debacles like the one we've seen with this tanker. It's just in the end completely counterproductive.
We should invite Max Boot on one day and have a chat with him.
I don't think he would accept.
Well, indeed.
All right. Super chat from Milos, 21 Canadian dollars. Thank you very much, Milos. And the final super chat from Onesie. We have Peter here. Okay, final super chat. Do you think a political system situation such as Russia, China, and Iran, where there's a leader that decides the long-term decisions for long-term, is better? good super chat to end this live stream.
No, not at all. I think we need to get back to the way the world has been run from time immemorial. You're going to have centers of power, and you have to negotiate, engage, hopefully avoid war. What we've been living in since the Second World War, the Cold War, and the end of the Cold War is a historical anomaly. Anomaly. We need to go back where states protect their interests, okay? States don't have friends. They have interests. And states that are run by ideology outside of maybe like Vatican City or something are not viable, okay? And so I really think that, unfortunately, we have had generations of this aberrational situation that people think it's the norm. It's not the norm. And I don't think we need strong men. We need strong societies that have values.
Yes.
That's what we need. And we need religion as well. All right? That's what we need. We don't need strong men.
Alexander,
Yeah,
final thought.
Well, what I would say, I mean, the one thing that I do think is that it does help if you're trying to run complicated things like economies and societies to plan ahead a bit. But I don't think you need a central place to do it, because what is a good plan for, say, Hangzhou in China may not be a good plan for Nizhny Novgorod in Russia. That's the role of national governments, and being responsive to their own people and working things out. I mean, the Chinese, as I said, have planned carefully for a situation where they might not have access to raw materials and resources, and that has driven them to seek a good relationship with Russia. The Russians saw what happened in the 2000s when they became over-dependent on the world financial system, and they've planned to change from that. We also see increasing amounts of military planning going on in different powers. But as I said, we don't need an overarching center, either in Eurasia or anything else. What I think we will see in Eurasia is a Eurasian community of nations emerging, loosely tied together and coordinating their foreign policy.
Countries that remain Vietnamese, countries that remain Chinese, countries that remain Filipino.
Exactly. But they will be coordinating their positions together on foreign policy, as the Russians and the Chinese increasingly do. They will be cooperating on military things, and they will be trading with each other on equal terms. And I think that's a good system, actually, and a system that could work well if it could be extended further.
Okay, we'll end it on that. Peter, what are you looking at this week going forward?
Everything that we've talked about.
Anything that we haven't? We didn't get to Italy, Salvini. We didn't get to Epstein. I mean, we've been going for 2 hours, 45 minutes, and we still didn't get to any of this.
No.
Well, that means we need to start doing this twice a week, you guys.
Well, I mean, there's lots to keep an eye on. We obviously need to keep. I too expect no great outcome out of the G7, but we will need to keep an eye on that. There will obviously also I obviously have to look at what's going to happen in Britain, whether there's going to be
that's your problem.
That's my problem. Whether there's going to be an election or not, whether we're going to have Brexit on the 31st of October, what Boris Johnson is going to do. I mean, all that I also have to look at. But as I said, the overarching issues are going to be the United States. That's where we're going to see what happen. We're going to be seeing whether the investigations into the Russiagate investigators are going to crystallize and what the political effect of that is going to be. We've got to see whether the Democrats get their act together and in what form, and we've got to see where the US economy is in.
Okay. And from Convo Couch, the final super chat, and we'll end it here. Thank you. I can't say enough about how much the three of you inspired many to just get out there and bring back the real news. Outstanding work, gentlemen. Thank you, Convo Couch, and that super chat. We will end this live stream. Peter Lavelle, host of RT's Crosstalk in Moscow. Thank you very much, Peter. And Alexander Mercuris, the Oracle of London in Germany. Thank you.
In Germany, yeah. In
Rheinland-Pfalz. Right. Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who joined us on this live stream. Thank you for your super chats. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for just joining us here. Thank you to everyone who's donated to us on PayPal, Patreon, Subscribestar, and for anybody who's bought something from the Duran shop, a shirt, a mug, one of our magic mugs. And once again, great shirt, Alexander. Color looks great. All right,
Very
everybody.
true.
Very, very true. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.